All right, everyone. We're gonna get started today. So the talk today is policy issues on the upcoming 2024 election, and we are lucky to be joined by four policy experts over at Rockefeller College. So we are joined by Susan Appe. Dr. Appe is an associate professor at Rockefeller College. Her policy expertise is in nonprofits and NGOs. We're also joined by Ashley Fox. Dr. Fox is an associate professor at Rockefeller College as well. Her expertise is in health policy. We are also joined by Mikhail Ivonchyk. Dr. Ivonchyk is an assistant professor here at Rockefeller, and his expertise is fiscal policy. Finally, we are joined by Ellen Rubin. Dr. Rubin is an associate professor at Rockefeller College. Her expertise is in diversity management. Now, before I pass it over to our panelists, I'm just going to lay out a couple of ground rules. So each panelist is going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, approximately. Once they are done, we will turn it over to audience questions, Q&A. So if you have any questions over the course of the presentation, you can just put them in the chat and I'll read them aloud to the panelists. You can ask a question to all four of them. You can ask a question to one in particular. You can also, if you'd like, put up the hand raise function. I'll be checking for that as well throughout, and I'll try to call on you. With that being said, I will pass it over to our policy experts.
I guess we didn't talk about who was going to speak first. I'm happy to start just because I'm listed first with the maybe last name Appe. Does that sound okay, or is that okay with everyone? Okay, I'm just okay, good afternoon, everyone. As Connor, thank you so much, Connor, for facilitating or moderating this series. It's really nice to bring folks together. As Connor mentioned, my name is Susan Appe, and most of my work is around nonprofits and NGOs. And the task we've been asked to do is talk about how the election and the different candidates are speaking about our topics. And so given my topic is super broad, nonprofits do a lot of things, and NGOs do a lot of things. Actually, they work in all of the areas and many more that we're going to talk about today. So it's a big task, but I'm going to kind of talk about just generally the nonprofit sector, just to give some background to give a sense of all the policy areas that nonprofits are involved in. And then I'll talk about just really quick about how the entire political spectrum uses and touts nonprofits as important, but for different reasons. And then I'll plant some observations around the election season right now to hopefully spur maybe some interest, and we can go into more detail about those, if that sounds okay. And so, as I mentioned, the nonprofit sector is super diverse. So nonprofits provide key public goods and services and address pressing challenges every day in communities in the US, but also globally. And I'll try to touch on that span. So they provide housing, nutrition, spiritual and artistic inspiration, disaster relief, and many other critical services. Again, some of which we'll talk about today in the panel. And they are diverse not only in type and what their mission and their services are, but also in size. So they range from all volunteer organizations with no revenue to multi-billion-dollar institution managed by super professionalized staff, sometimes with budgets larger than the budgets of specific countries. And so any election cycle is rather uncertain for the nonprofit sector, and it raises several concerns and observations. But so I'll mention all the nonprofits in which we're going to speak about today are based and legalized, incorporated in the US, but they might be serving local communities, they might have a national scope, or they might be serving communities outside of the US. In the US, there are about 1.8 million nonprofit organizations. These are organizations that fall under the 501c organizations under the Internal Revenue Services, the Internal Revenue Code. But the scope of tax-exempt organizations or the tax-exempt economy is much larger. There are certain kinds of organizations that you might think about being nonprofits, such as churches that aren't actually required to file tax returns. So we don't really track that via the government. But for example, churches who aren't part of that 1.8 million nonprofits, the estimation is that they are raising well over $1 billion or $100 billion in revenues annually. And so, and they're not captured in that 1.8 million nonprofits. But the organizations that we do have in the Internal Revenue Code, they contribute an estimated 1.4 trillion to the US economy. This is numbers from 2022, the year 2022, comprising just shy of 6% of the GDP. And nonprofits as a sector employ 12.5 million paid workers, over 10% of the private workforce. And so these are numbers from the independent sector, which is a trade association for nonprofits. And nonprofits are generally where Americans give their philanthropic donations. And so we're at over $550 billion going to nonprofits through individual contributions and philanthropic donations. And so this is an active sector, right? And because of that, across the political spectrum, all in the political spectrum have touted the importance of nonprofits, have used nonprofits strategically. So if we kind of think about from a more liberal standpoint, supporters of the nonprofit sector consider it a really socially committed sector made up of individuals who want to make a difference and create positive social change. The nonprofit sector garnered a lot of trust, especially after the 1960s when the promise of the Great Society maybe fell short and trust in government fell a bit. Nonprofits became really legitimate service providers, in particular in the US. And from the liberal side, nonprofits have generally been thought to be able to galvanize or mobilize people in communities to seek alternatives to solving key public problems, from everything from poverty to environmental concerns. On the conservative side, now the nonprofit sector has been positioned as an alternative to direct government intervention, right, in the hopes of shrinking, particularly at the federal level, the size of government. Conservative thinkers have also thought of the nonprofit sector, particularly faith-based nonprofit organizations, as being able to provide a moral or spiritual grounding that government could never supply. And then nonprofits are thought to be flexible and innovative, much more than the government in terms of providing public programs at the local level, which conservatives tend to favor. So that's kind of big picture thinking across the political spectrum. I think I'll leave with a couple policy areas or concerns around the nonprofit sector, which again is super diverse and broad. But any election cycle might, at the federal level in particular, might have implications for philanthropic give and incentivizing philanthropic giving, which I can talk about. There is concerns around shifts in federal funding to nonprofits, different reimbursement rates, and of course, tax policy is very intertwined with the nonprofit sector, which I can talk about. And because it's such a workforce, the nonprofit industry, just like any other industries, the nonprofit sector is concerned about its employees, about childcare, access, retirement savings, healthcare, providing healthcare for their employees, and other types of costs for employees. And then there is always a concern that election fundraising might crowd out charitable giving rates. And there's not much evidence that this is the case, but there's always concerns that might happen. And then there's always anticipation of kind of the losing side, what happens on that end. So there's this idea of rage giving or a conservative bounce or a liberal bounce, right? We saw that in 2016 after Republican Trump won, that we saw a liberal bounce in nonprofits where there were philanthropic giving and volunteering rose in reaction to the election results. And then the last point I'll just mention that is sort of related to research is that there are pleads to the federal government to provide more and better data on the nonprofit sector and the role that the federal government has in making that available. And so that's something kind of on the policy agenda for nonprofits and in consideration around the election currently. And so I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that spurred some interest, and we can get more specific in different policy areas like the arts or social services, international development, where nonprofits are very active, and some of the implications and maybe the how the different candidates are framing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Appe, for bravely going first. I think from this point forward, if it's okay with the panelists, we'll just go alphabetical order here. So that will mean we turn it over to Dr. Fox now, if that's okay. But yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah, happy to go next and follow the alphabet here. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on how a Trump or Harris presidency might impact health policy. A lot to cover here. So let me just first start with the scenario under which Harris wins the presidency. So while surely a Harris victory bodes much better for healthcare than a Trump victory, if your goal is to try to increase access to affordable healthcare for more people, nothing currently suggests that Harris will do anything more than fairly incremental changes to the healthcare system. And this is despite the fact that during the Democratic primaries in the lead up to the 2020 election, Harris tried to make herself seem quite progressive on healthcare when the political winds suggested that this was sort of a politically astute stance. She did briefly embrace Medicare for All and was a co-sponsor of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill in the Senate. In 2017, she was one of the first senators to endorse Sanders' single-payer healthcare proposal. However, she has since backed away from that position, instead favoring more incremental approaches to health reform. For a while, she still backed a more incremental but still quite progressive public option. So this would be a Medicare buy-in option that would allow anyone who finds themselves outside of insurance coverage to buy into an affordable Medicare option. But more recently, she seems to have also backed away from that and now is primarily committed to more incremental reforms. So, in contrast to, I guess, the sort of conservative side trying to depict her as, a Marxist or an extremist in some ways. I mean, really, if anything, her stance has gotten more and more incremental over time. But this is also one of the criticisms that people have made about whether she has sort of genuine convictions or is just sort of being a politician's politician and, changing her stances depending on where the political winds seem to be blowing. Now, clearly, a Harris presidency would be better for abortion rights and women's reproductive health than a Trump presidency, if that is something that you favor. Harris has publicly advocated for the Women's Health Protection Act, which would legislatively codify women's abortion rights at the federal level. Harris has also backed Biden's efforts to negotiate lower prescription drug prices for seniors on Medicare. This was one of Biden's signature healthcare achievements. He didn't actually do a whole lot on healthcare during his presidency, but this was definitely one of the signature achievements that people point to. And she has said that she would want to accelerate talks with pharmaceutical companies to continue lowering prescription drug costs by allowing Medicare to negotiate costs. And like Biden, Harris has vowed to cap the price of insulin at $35 for everyone, not just seniors. So currently it's sort of applying to seniors. And then also to cap out-of-pocket expenses for prescription drugs at $2,000 per year for everyone. On maternal health, Harris has said that she is dedicated to improving maternal health, especially for women of color. She introduced the Maternal Care Act, which aims to address racial disparities in maternal outcomes by increasing funding for implicit bias training for healthcare professionals and expanding access to prenatal and postpartum care. And she has also advocated for expanding access to mental health services and strengthening public health infrastructure to ensure preparedness for future pandemics. So overall, for those interested in expanding access to health services and keeping healthcare affordable for the average citizen, a Harris presidency will likely do that. However, for anyone who is a fan of moving towards a more universalistic, sort of Medicare for all style healthcare system and really tackling some of the major challenges in our healthcare system currently, like the spiraling costs and the incursion of private equity into healthcare, the closures of hospital systems, including, even downstate, which is affecting us here at SUNY. They might be a little bit disappointed in a Harris presidency because she seems mostly committed to more incremental reforms. Now, in regards to a Trump presidency, we may not see such a dramatic attempt to overturn Obamacare that we saw in his first term, and that was narrowly defeated at that time. But there are other ways that a Trump presidency has in mind to roll back public health care protections and move again in a sort of greater direction of access to care being based on ability to pay. A lot of this is outlined in Project 2025, which is widely regarded as the blueprint for Trump if he were to win a second term, and was written by many of his former advisors. Project 2025 outlines several conservative touch points for healthcare. So these include, first of all, block granting Medicaid, which would essentially gut the program in a very similar way to how welfare reform gutted our cash assistance programs in the 1990s. It also proposes adding non-evidence-based work requirements and lifetime caps on Medicaid benefits, which would inevitably result in reduced coverage for many beneficiaries. Project 2025 also aims to make further cuts to Medicare. And in general, Project 2025 frames Medicare and Medicaid as key drivers of the national budget deficit, and advocates for reforms that would decrease federal spending on these programs, likely involving tightening of eligibility requirements and reducing covered benefits, so various forms of austerity. On reproductive health, Project 2025 aims to further dismantle access to abortion care by revoking the approval of mifepristone, which is a common drug used in cases of miscarriage, but also for medicated abortion. And also aims to reinstate restrictions on abortion access, like banning telehealth services for medicated abortions and enforcing stricter regulations under the Comstock Act, which would contribute to sort of nationwide restrictions on abortion services. Another way that the Trump presidency could be devastating to healthcare and public health is if Trump follows through on his seeming promise to appoint RFK Jr. to lead HHS. RFK Jr. is a prominent figure in the anti-vax movement. Of course, he was a presidential candidate himself and later stepped out, but he has expressed skepticism about vaccine effectiveness and has been a vocal critic of vaccines since at least the mid-2000s. My timer is telling me to wrap up, so I will just make one final point, which is that the recent Supreme Court decision to overturn Chevron deference could also have a fairly devastating impact on public health policies and regulatory practices, especially under a Trump presidency, as Chevron deference, it previously allowed courts to defer to federal agencies' interpretations of ambiguous statutes, which would allow public health experts to use their expertise in specialized areas like healthcare to, sort of interpret ambiguous aspects of health statutes. But with the deference eliminated, courts can take a more active role in interpreting laws, which could potentially lead to more of an incursion of politics into expert decision-making processes. So I will leave it there, hopefully not on too pessimistic of a note, but I will turn it over to Mikhail.
Thank you, Ashley. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm Mikhail, and I'm here to talk to you about fiscal policy. More specifically, how the policy changes that both candidates suggested may affect federal revenues and expenditures and the economy. So apparently, both candidates made a lot of statements and about different programs they are suggesting, and so in their speeches and official documents, and I'm going to focus on those that are mentioned more or less consistently because they can comment on many things and that have larger impact. So So with Vice President Kamala Harris, it looks like she's taking a moderate approach to economic policy and fiscal policy. It's not very different from what President Biden has been doing, but there are some changes. So she suggested tax credit for first-time home buyers. Too bad it's too late for me, but for younger folks, obviously that will be a good thing for trying to buy a house. So she promised to boost housing supply by supporting affordable housing and expand child tax credit, earned income tax credit, access to childcare. And she also proposed to make create different incentives for small businesses. So combine this economic plan, they try to tout as the opportunity economy. So because it's targeted to help the low-income earners and maybe middle class, but not as much to the wealthier parts of the population. So overall, many analysts noticed that her campaign shows the popular parts of the Biden agenda, but it's much more business friendly. And obviously, the target groups are those that the campaign thinks will be important. But the plan doesn't go into detail, since we're talking about revenues and expenditures, doesn't talk into detail how exactly they're going to pay for this, because if you look at every single policy that I just listed, it's going to cost a lot of money. But there are some suggestions that can help compensate the loss of the revenue. And so the campaign suggested they will have the large share of this lost revenue will come from higher corporate tax. They are proposing to increase the corporate income tax, capital gains tax, tax rates, and impose additional or increase taxes for those making $400,000 a year or more. So in addition to that, as has been mentioned, Kamala Harris is planning to try to negotiate lower prices or adopt a law that will allow to lower the prices on different prescription drugs, which will supposedly save a lot of money to the federal budget. So for the former President Trump economic policy, or as they call it, Trumponomics, there are two big items that the former president keeps mentioning: a lot of tax cuts and high tariffs on imports from different countries. So, but there are things like lower corporate tax. They want to lower it even more, extend his own tax that were adopted during his first term. And so these are set to expire in 2025. He's trying to extend these for individuals, so individuals will keep getting lower tax rates. And he also proposed, that's a different thing, no taxes on tips, on overtime, and taxation of Social Security benefits. So that's something new. But you can see that all of these, again, will reduce the amount of revenue that will come into the federal budget. And effectively, it will cut basically hundreds of billions of dollars worth of revenue. And his campaign has some plans or some suggestions how they would compensate for the loss, try to make up. So one big thing is the tariffs. And if we impose higher tariffs in theory on goods that are coming from the outside, the revenue raised will compensate for the losses that we used to create other policies. So in theory, it's intended to protect domestic manufacturers, because now importing goods are more expensive and it's easier to compete with them. So that's in theory could boost domestic economy. In practice, this is not how it works. And first of all, there are almost always retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports. So U.S. Exporters will be able to sell less outside. Then also in practice, U.S. importers, they will actually pass these costs on to consumers. So the effect of the tariffs is that the prices on imported goods will go up. And when prices go up, we call it inflation. And then the net effect usually of such policies is that the economy slows down. So another way to compensate for the drop in revenue, if this policy were implemented, is they suggest to repeal energy environmental spending and tax cuts. So there's some some of the, so they cost money, and they will remove that. Also, he proposed to remove environmental regulation to allow oil companies to drill in protected lands to generate additional revenue. There is oil, if we extract it, we can sell it, make money. So another thing that is not, well, it is actually economic policy. So the proposal to deport undocumented immigrants, that would have an effect also on prices, because that reduces labor supply, increases labor costs, and as a result, people buying products here in the United States will have to pay more. So overall, if we look at the list of these things, both use pretty much traditional approaches to attract voters by promising them more money, more wealth. And from the fiscal policy perspective, there is a problem. The problem of the deficits and the problem of having higher expenditures than revenues, and what has been proposed to address that. And the net effect of both plans is kind of uncertain, because there are different estimates. They make ambiguous statements, so it's not clear. But overall, the net effect of the Trump plan will likely contribute to larger deficits, and according to some estimates, will raise the federal debt by twice as much as Kamala Harris. So the deficits will exist and the debt will grow, but it will grow probably higher under the current Trump plan. And what is very important is that both candidates, again, we're talking about fiscal policy, they avoid the elephant in the room, which is the federal debt. And not a single candidate mentions it. And it's a huge issue that is going to affect everyone's rather sooner than later. And they conveniently avoid that. And so there are some comments from people closely observing the campaigns, and such as, well, allegedly nonpartisan committee for responsible federal budget. They both say that both candidates basically, if they would at best maintain the status quo, and at worst add tremendously to our debt and deficit. So the minimum is to continue to add 2 trillion to the debt. That's the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, it will increase. The debt will grow much faster under both candidates. And they also warn of an eventual fiscal crisis if they don't start dealing with that seriously. So just want to remind everyone, all these policies, everything what they promise, these are not free. Everyone will eventually pay for that with interest, because it's financed with debt, most of that. So that's me.
Great. Thank you, Mikhail, and thank you, Susan and Ashley, for sharing your ideas. So I'm not sure if I should be excited to go last or worried about it. But as Connor mentioned, I'm going to focus on diversity management issues. My expertise is on government personnel management and employee perceptions of fairness in the workplace. And my recent research has focused on retaliation for filing discrimination complaints, and examines the Supreme Court's 2023 decision on affirmative action in college admissions. So as I talk about the Trump and Harris records here, I want to focus in on 3 specific issues. One is their records on diversity management. The second one will be their approach to trying to reduce pay discrimination. And the third will focus on how they think about merit-based hiring in government. So first, let's focus on diversity management activities and how these 2 candidates approach this topic. So diversity management in organizations includes a lot of different things. In some organizations, it's about hiring. In other organizations, it's about retention. In a lot of places, we think about training on different topics relating to diversity and inclusion. Organizations also have to inform their employees that discrimination is not welcome in the workplace, and if they think they've experienced discrimination, how they can file a discrimination complaint to be investigated. But I want to focus in on the candidates in relation specifically to diversity management trainings. Now, in New York State, there is a state law saying that every organization with 3 or more employees needs to go through annual training focused mostly on sexual harassment, but can also cover other issues about diversity management. And I'm sure, since we're all in New York here, we all have strong opinions about the effectiveness of those trainings, the content of those trainings. Maybe we prefer there was other material in there, leaving some things out. Maybe you feel like it's not a great use of your time. But the goal of these trainings, however your organization approaches it, is twofold. One is to make employees aware of their rights, their right to work in a workplace free of discrimination, but also to work incrementally to build a work environment where people feel included and empowered to participate in decision-making, and to bring their full skill set to the work of the organization. So Donald Trump, since he was president previously, has had very strong opinions to try to demonize these sorts of trainings and to try to reduce the frequency with which they are occurring. And one of the challenges with this is that there is federal law, rules, and regulations, state law, rules, and regulations, and multiple court decisions that say employers should offer these trainings to reduce the degree to which they are liable for discrimination lawsuits. But regardless of these laws and regulations and court decisions, the Trump administration had a pretty significant track record of attempting to get rid of these trainings. So, it's one thing to be frustrated with the training you go through in your workplace. It's another thing to think that these trainings should be banned and are counterproductive. And so if you are in the camp that not only are these annoying, but they should be banned, then Donald Trump is your candidate. On the other hand, if you think that these trainings are annoying, but there is some utility to having them, then Kamala Harris is your candidate. So to give an example of this, while Trump was president, he signed Executive Order 13950 in September 2020, banning many diversity trainings in federal agencies. And this also sought to ban trainings relating to diversity management in federal contractors and in organizations receiving federal grant money, which would include state agencies, including state universities. And this executive order was written in such a way that there were actually free speech concerns, leading to many lawsuits that were filed to try to rescind this executive order. On Biden's first or second day in office, he signed an executive order rescinding this Trump order. So that is no longer in place. But Trump has continued to express the rhetoric that he would put this executive order back in place. And there is a lot of language to this effect in Project 2025, which Dr. Fox mentioned earlier. I will also note that J.D. Vance, President Trump's VP candidate, a few weeks before he was selected by Trump to be the vice presidential nominee, proposed his own version of anti-diversity management legislation co-authored with House Representative Michael Cloud. So Trump has been pretty consistent about this since he began running for president before 2016. And Biden and Harris have been consistent in supporting these sorts of activities in organizations across the country. And I'm happy to take more questions on these. On the second point of comparison I would like to make between Harris and Trump is focusing on reducing pay discrimination. Now, under the Obama administration, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued regulations that would require businesses to report information about how employees are paid in a new way. So the EEOC has been collecting pay data for decades from private employers. The Obama administration wanted to change how employers were reporting this to have more data broken down by gender and race. And the reason they wanted this was to make it easier to investigate claims of pay discrimination. Investigating claims of pay discrimination are notoriously difficult because of lack of access to pay information on how people are paid within organizations. So Obama's proposed regulation would have helped to reduce this barrier to investigating pay discrimination cases. One of the early actions of Trump's Office of Management and Budget was to rescind that proposal from the Obama administration. So the Office of Management and Budget has an office that reviews proposed regulations before they become finalized, and that office issued a memo saying we are not going to go forward with this change in salary reporting. So blocking new ways to investigate pay discrimination. Trump otherwise left rules about pay discrimination in place, but he blocked this new regulation that would have made it easier to investigate it. On the other hand, Biden and Harris have made specific actions and finalized rules that block employers from considering previous pay when making pay decisions when hiring people for new jobs. And there have been multiple reports in the media on how Harris was involved in this multi-agency effort to finalize this regulation. And this new regulation on not allowing federal agencies to evaluate previous pay rates was issued in January of this year, 2024. And Harris was involved in that effort. So the bottom line here is if you're interested in the government taking more deliberate steps to reduce pay discrimination, Harris is your candidate. And if you would rather see the current rules as they are stay in place without providing investigators additional tools, then Trump is your candidate. I will say the regulations proposed by Obama, many argue that they were very burdensome in terms of the reporting requirements. And those were some of the arguments to rescind that proposal from the Obama administration. The last policy comparison I want to make between Harris and Trump is on their interest in protecting merit-based hiring in government. So now at federal, state, and local levels, when we are hiring your average government employee, they have to go through an evaluation process to show that they have the knowledge and skills and competencies to carry out a specific job in a specific program. And during the Trump administration, he took multiple actions to undermine the protections provided by the merit system, including proposing Schedule F in October of 2020, which would have moved a significant number of federal government employees who are protected by the merit system into positions where they would essentially be serving at will. The Biden administration rescinded this order, and over the course of the Trump administration, there were other activities that sought to undermine the merit system. And while Harris was a senator serving on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, during multiple committee hearings, she asked questions and pressed Trump political appointees, raising her concerns about how various proposals would undermine merit protections and thus undermine the ability of federal agencies to bring their expertise to bear when making decisions. Now, of course, Dr. Fox raised this point on the Raimondo decision, undermining the Chevron deference, and we can have some more conversation about that too. I think that this decision is going to undermine any president, either make it difficult for President Harris or President Trump to get anything done, because it would undermine the ability of government employees who have expertise to use that expertise to inform government policy. But in terms of merit-based hiring, Trump has a track record of trying to undermine merit-based hiring, and this is underlined and in bold font in the Project 2025 documentation. And Harris has a record as a senator and as vice president supporting protections for the merit system. And with that, I know we're all happy to answer questions, and we thank all of you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you to all of you for your presentations. It looks like we have 2 questions in the chat right now. One of them is addressed to all of the panelists, the other one just to Dr. Appe. So it looks like we have about 20 minutes. I'll read the first question. It comes from Dr. Novkov. She observes that it seems like climate-driven disasters touch on a lot of these areas, and I am wondering if you can comment. Can the United States continue to rely on nonprofit organizations to provide crucial capacity to respond? What are the public health implications, including for our allocation of public health resources? And how can our fiscal policies prepare us to manage national budgeting in years when the nation may experience multi-billion-dollar disasters? So whoever wants to go first can take it. I'll pass it over to all of you.
I can go first. Again, I don't have good news, but the way it usually works with fiscal policy, you save money in good times so that when lean times come, you can use the reserves, and if necessary, you borrow money. This is how it's supposed to work. The federal government has been borrowing consistently for 50 years nonstop. With a short, there was one time in the 90s when the budget was technically balanced, one time. For 50 years. And it took 200 years to accumulate $3 trillion in debt, and then 30 years to accumulate additional $30 trillion in debt. That, if they don't address the deficit and they don't try to balance the revenues and expenditures, their borrowing capacity is limited. So as a result, they don't have their own reserves, sufficient reserves. They consistently rely on borrowing. So if a disaster strikes, a big one that affects multiple states at the same time, the federal government is, of course, going to turn to more borrowing. But the market so far has been looking at the US economy and all the projections. They've been okay with that. They've been lending money to the federal government at a very low rate, which is what allowed to keep borrowing nonstop. It's a quite literal addiction. And but if a disaster happens, and they seem to be happening more frequently, and they're bigger and more frequent, and they affect larger areas with larger financial impacts, then the market may look and say, hold on a second, we've reached a point where it may not be the case that you're going to be able to repay. So we're going to jack up the interest rates, and you're going to have to pay much more than 2 or 3% they've been paying so far. And that will cause a lot of implications for everyone, because someone have to pay that. They will have to increase taxes substantially and lower the expenditures to balance the budget. Not to balance, but just to reduce the deficit. And that means you pay every dollar, but you get back 60 cents. We're getting 80 cents now because 20 cents is going towards servicing the debt. We'll be getting much less, but we'll be paying much more. The government may not want to do that, and they say, hey, we just print the money. The federal government can do that. If they print the money, the effect is not much better, because most likely, there are many assumptions, but most likely when you just turn the printer on, the inflation goes up, as you all learned in recent years. There are many scenarios. It may not go up and so on. If there are economists, they can explain how that works, but they will turn on the printer and the prices will go up, and the low income, mid income people will pay either way. So not well prepared. It is what it is. I'm sorry I don't have any better news.
Do you want to go next, Susan, or do you want? Okay, I'll just mention a few things in relation to public health, and mainly that public health has increasingly become concerned with climate-related disasters, and there's a whole kind of subfield within public health paying attention to those issues. I mean, there are obviously like immediate public health implications of all different types of climate-related disasters. Heat waves have immediate impacts, cause mortality and morbidity. It increases respiratory conditions. For older adults, they can be deadly. Flooding can cause immediate harm and, drowning, injuries, but also can lead to the resurgence of certain infectious diseases related to sanitation, like, cholera. Wildfires obviously can be just deadly unto themselves, but also increase respiratory illnesses from smoke inhalation and COPD, and other public health consequences. There's also this kind of resurgence of vector-borne diseases. So both novel infectious or vector-borne diseases like zoonoses, for instance, because like COVID, for instance, because of the way that climate change is altering habitats and geographic range of different vectors, but we're also seeing like things like malaria and dengue and Zika move into places where it hadn't been present before, and some people link that to climate change. So there's a variety of connections between the climate change and climate disasters and health. But I think in terms of solutions, unfortunately, public health doesn't really have that much to offer beyond what emergency preparedness already offers, right? Like we need to be prepared. We need to have better disaster response infrastructure. We need to build resilience, adaptation. But, the deeper policy solutions really fall outside of the sector, the public health sector, right? So this is kind of always a constant tension is, public health isn't really empowered to do the things that it would do to actually need to do to prevent some of this from happening. That much deeper types of policies are needed to address that. I will note, sort of as a random side note, it was interesting being in France this summer, where they're sort of dealing with heat waves in a very different way than we are, but it raised questions that, I think we need to address in the future. Like, for instance, in France, they're not very big on air conditioning. This was a point of consternation during the Olympics. Somehow they didn't feel the need to provide air conditioning to people, even though I can attest to the fact it was very hot. Their solutions are kind of putting a lot of the onus on the individual, and keeping the costs of electricity very high. But it is something that we're going to need to address at a more fundamental level as the climate gets warmer, and there are places that are really uninhabitable without air conditioning, but that puts strains on our grid and our infrastructure. But again, those policy solutions fall outside of the field of public health, right? So it becomes this challenge where public health all they can do is respond to the problems that are out there, but they don't really have direct control over the solutions. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'll be very brief in terms of the question: can the U.S. continue to rely on nonprofit organizations to provide critical capacity to respond? And I would say, if it's a can, yes, but if it's a should, that's I'm not sure, right? And that I think is across either campaign. And I guess I should underline that neither of the campaigns have a platform for nonprofit organizations, just to be clear. It's all across the different policy areas. So that will all affect, as I mentioned in the intro, how nonprofits function. But I think the question here is interesting in the sense that, this will kind of tie into the next question that was posed around the different tax codes, is that nonprofit organizations, so I mentioned there were, 1.8 million nonprofit organizations. The majority of those are public charities, 501c3s, the ones that are providing different public goods and services, both tangible and intangible. There's about 1.4 million 501c3s, and then there's a whole bunch of others, up to, I think, 26 different tax codes, right? But one of the things that gets missed with the 501c3s that are providing important public goods and services that are responding to, climate-driven disasters, as the question poses, is that they're not only responding, but they also have the ability, to a certain extent, to be pushing for policy change and to be advocating around changes that might lessen the burden that communities feel around climate change. And I think that often gets associated only with, if you look at the chat, some of the other tax code designations of other types of tax exempt organizations like 501c4s and 501c6s. So 501c4s are social welfare organizations that do have a mandate to be politically active. 501c6s are what we would consider chambers of commerce, business leagues, that kind of thing, that also engage in more political activity than what 501c3s do. But 501c3s can engage in certain types of advocacy around causes and even sometimes around legislation. They just can't engage in partisan politics, right? And so I think the space around disaster relief, yes, they can respond, but I think there's also the burden on nonprofits, whoever wins the election, to also be active, even 501c3s, in advocating for communities around resilience, as Ashley mentioned, and other types of tools that we know work in response to the increasing threats of disaster. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So we have two questions here. Oh, it looks like we have another. We'll see how many of these we can get to here. So this question is again directed to Dr. Appe here. Please expand on however you'd like. So this is from Michael Tobman. He asks, he says, in addition to their policy and services and educational roles, not-for-profits are also political actors themselves, with C4s and C6s serving as sorts of campaign operations. Is this an overall corruption of the role of not-for-profits or appropriate advocacy extensions of their work?
Yeah, and I think it kind of is an extension of what I was just mentioning. It's a good question. I guess it's what are your normative assumptions of the nonprofit sector? For me, I want to see nonprofit organizations, even 501c3s, within the limits outlined by the IRS, engaging more in advocacy for causes that can help and that can help them achieve their missions, right? And so I don't necessarily see 501c4s and 501c6s as corrupting the tax exemption tax code. But you're seeing more and more organizations across the political spectrum have 501c3s and then have another arm of a 501c4 that can engage more deliberately without the constraints from IRS and doesn't threaten its tax exemption status. And I think we'll continue to see that. I don't personally think it's a corruption, but again, I think it does depend on what your normative assumptions are about nonprofit organizations. And I think they are political, again, within the constraints of the IRS, and certainly policy actors. And so it's a really good question. And I'd be curious what the question asker thinks themselves, but thank you for posing it.
All right, awesome. So we have another question. This one is for Dr. Rubin from Hong Seok Lee. He asks, do you foresee any potential impacts on diversity management, especially in recruitment and hiring for government positions, resulting from the ban on race-based affirmative action in colleges?
Yes, so thank you for this difficult question. I think there's a short-term and a long-term answer. So in the short term, I don't anticipate that this ruling by the Supreme Court is going to impact hiring in government and the makeup of the people who take those jobs. In the long term, it might. But the news has been covering in a fair amount of detail different universities publishing their admission rates for different groups of students, and some universities are reporting lower admission and attendance rates for marginalized groups. And these gaps are varying by universities. There are also stories that enrollment in historically Black colleges and universities have increased dramatically this year. But those of us in higher ed also know that the disaster with the FAFSA forms, the free application for student aids, may also be playing a role in these lower enrollment numbers. So we'll have to see in a couple of years if we're still seeing this drop in enrollment and attendance from marginalized groups. If we do see these lower enrollment rates, it could have a longer-term impact on the ability of government at any level, federal, state, and local, to hire folks who meet the minimum hiring qualifications, which are often college degrees. And if you don't go to college and don't have that, it's hard to qualify for that unless you start in a lower position in government and work your way up and build up those years of experience to qualify otherwise. So it's hard to tell. And the FAFSA screw up makes it even harder. Yeah, to be determined. Thank you for the question.
All right, well, we have time for one last question, and this one is also directed to Dr. Appe. So we have a student, Erin McElhaney here. She is doing a research project on U.S. government international development efforts, and she would love to hear more from Dr. Appe about international development under the Harris versus Trump administrations. How will NGO-facilitated international development be impacted under a Harris or Trump administration? Will it take on a larger or smaller role compared to government agencies?
Great. Yeah, this is a great question, Erin, and I'm going to be brief because I know we're at the end here. But this is actually an area where I have done some research. And when Trump first came to office in 2016, I wrote an article in The Conversation posing the question, will Trump cuts inspire more do-it-yourself aid? So aid done by nonprofit organizations, by private citizens, right? Sending money abroad. And I was curious because at that time, he was proposing, and it did end up coming to fruition, except a little bit lower, about 28% cuts in foreign aid and diplomacy, right? And so was that going to ramp up NGO? And what does that look like? Because still in the US, USAID, which you mentioned, Erin, has about $20 million annually for grants for NGOs doing work abroad. So they were concerned around that for sure. And I think that if we were looking at Trump versus Harris, again, I haven't found specifics in terms of their platform, but Trump's America First agenda, I think, really positions international development actors in a disadvantage of sorts. This is also the case with us removing ourselves from international agreements. If that were the case under Trump, that would certainly affect global health. I'm sure Ashley could speak to that in terms of, and NGOs working in that space. And Harris, while she hasn't necessarily been very vocal around NGOs in particular and international development, she has visited, she went to Africa and has engaged in conversations around issues in the global South. And so we can maybe see that as a signal that she it's of interest, or at least to maintain what the Biden administration has done, or expand it a bit. But that's what I can say. I think that, again, the Trump administration could, because of its America First agenda, I think NGOs doing international development work will feel that. And so I'll leave it at that.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Appe, Dr. Fox, Dr. Ivonchyk, and Dr. Rubin. This was super informative. And thank you to our audience today. We had several excellent questions. You can join the Rockefeller College election series on Wednesday, same time, 12 to 1 o'clock on Zoom. For Dr. Novkov, she is going to talk about the Supreme Court, which is going to be a lot of fun. But once again, thank you, everyone.